Mapping Learning to Earning Pathways and Evidence Gap Map, which is jointly hosted by 3IE and the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. The webinar will present findings from the first systematic mapping of rigorous evidence on technical and vocational education and training, TVET, and skills in low and middle income countries. The Evidence Gap Map, or EGM, provides a comprehensive overview of what has been researched, where evidence is concentrated, and where important gaps remain. We will also offer the opportunity to discuss priority areas for policy and future research in the context of a rapidly evolving labor market. In case you don't know 3IE yet, we are a global leader in producing and synthesizing rigorous evidence. Established in 2008, we support impact evaluations, systematic reviews, and evidence maps that examine questions around what works, for whom, why, and at what cost in low and middle income countries. We're also a strong advocate for the generation and use of quality evidence in decision making, and we work with a range of organizations from governments, foundations, NGOs, development agencies, and researchers to address pressing policy and program challenges like the one that gathers us today. Before we kick off, a few quick housekeeping notes. We would like to know you, the audience, a little bit better, so feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box with your name, your organization, and where you're joining from today. You can also send questions to the presenters at any point. And when you send these questions, please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, not the chat function. This event is also live streamed on YouTube. And it's shared on social media. And if you are joining us via live stream, please share your questions in the comments box. With that, I would like now to hand over to Abdulrahman Nagy, our program director from Middle East and North Africa program at 3IE, for his opening remarks. Over to you, Mayor.
Thank you so much, Constanza, and it's a great pleasure to be here today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch event. At 3IE, we believe that better outcomes, that better evidence leads to better decisions, and ultimately better development outcomes. As countries grapple with high youth unemployment and rapidly changing labor markets driven by technological advances, artificial intelligence, and the green transition, there is an urgent need to understand what works in helping young people move successfully from learning to earning. Yet, despite growing investments in technical and vocational education and training, there has been no comprehensive picture of the evidence available to inform these investments. This is why, in partnership with FCDO, 3IE undertook the development of this evidence gap map on TVET and skills. This work builds on the first phase of this collaboration, where we worked with expertise from across academia, policymakers, and the practice to develop a shared framework for understanding the transition from learning to earning. The framework identified the key interventions, outcomes, and pathway through which the TVET and the skills program can improve employment perspectives, and this also provides the foundation for systematically mapping and assessing the global evidence base. As part of this evidence gap map, we were able to bring together 510 impact evaluations and 17 systematic reviews. The map provides a rigorous overview of where evidence exists, where it is concentrated, and where important gaps remain. It is designed to support policymakers, practitioners, and researchers, as well as founders in making more informed decisions about future programs and research investments. Today's webinar is an opportunity to reflect on the key findings from this work and discuss what they mean for policy, practice, and future research. We hope the insights generated through this evidence mapping exercise will help strengthen investments in skills development and create more effective pathways to employment for young people across low and middle income countries. I'm personally very much looking forward to your questions, your thoughts, and the valuable discussions that we'll be getting during our webinar today. Thank you so much all. Over to Constanza.
Thank you, Abdulrahman. Let's now hand over to Callum Hebron, Higher Education and Skills Policy and Program Advisor at FCDO, who's going to provide a little bit more background and context for this project from FCDO's perspective. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Constanza, and Abdulrahman, thank you for that really clear introduction to why we're here today and what we're going to be talking about. So I think my job here is to talk a little bit about the background of how we got to where we are. The FCDO, like many other institutions, and fantastic to see so many institutions represented in those introductions in the chat, we are wrangling with a changing environment in terms of development policy, in terms of the work we do overseas, and in terms of how we tackle education broadly. When the question came to the FCDO of how do we manage ongoing skills programming, we felt that we weren't confident that we had enough evidence and enough clear direction on what would be the most impactful. And it is fundamentally that question that has led us to this stage in the project. In order to tackle that question, we knew we needed to be systematic. We knew that we weren't going to be able to tackle it all in one bite. That is why this work has been broken down into the phases that it has been. But we're really excited to be able to take this opportunity now to present what is, quite frankly, a far larger evidence gap map than many will have expected to be able to see on an area like TVET and skills. I think there are still fantastic questions to be asked of this data set. But the thing that I have found working on this project and seeing it flourish and be picked up so widely by the TVET and skills community is that there is more evidence out there than we thought. And that evidence is high quality, but we do still need to do some work on it. And so I think that's a really interesting part of acknowledging that this is by no means an end point for this project. We are definitely looking at what comes next, and we're interested in challenges, critiques, and things that will help us improve this in future. I'm really excited for us to all see this kind of evidence together and figure out what it means for each of us individually. But mainly, I've been exceptionally excited to be working with 3IE and having their expertise to pull together what is a phenomenal project that has really gathered some global renown, not just represented by those in this room, but also our phenomenal advisory group who have managed to steer us away from certain icebergs and have given us supportive critique and comfort throughout this program. And so a massive thank you to everyone who's been a part of that, and a massive thank you to 3IE for steering this work. And I will leave it there until the Q&A. Thank you very much, Constanza.
Great. Thank you, Callum. Thank you for your remarks and for joining us today. So we are now ready to start the main section of today's lunch, the results of the evidence gap map, which will be presented by my colleagues Pierre Marion, Senior Research Associate, and Diana Córdoba Arauz, Research Assistant, both from 3IE. I'll let you guys take it.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, Constanza, AR, and Callum for this introduction. So with my colleague Diana, we'll be presenting the main findings and the implications of this evidence gap map, so the systematic mapping of the rigorous evidence in TVET, so technical and vocational education and training in low and middle income countries. So AR and Callum have provided some very important information, have set the stage for this presentation. So I'll start sharing my screen. And so in this short presentation, sorry, I'll just move this. Yeah. So in the short presentation, I will start by discussing the background. I'll just move it slightly. Sorry, I'm just moving this. Yeah. I'll present the background, go into more detail in what Callum indicated, talk about the methods, then I'll pass it on to Diana, who will discuss the results, and then I'll finish with the key takeovers and implications. So as Callum touched upon, just to give you some more background on the situation in low and middle income countries, situation is problematic. There's increasing pressures on the labor market. So there's obviously the green energy transition, the emergence of AI, so changing roles, automation of roles, which means that labor skills are radically changing year by year. In addition to that, it's estimated that 1.2 billion young people will join the labor force from developing countries and emerging countries. So the economy might be changing, but the skills need to also change for people not to be excluded from these changes, the transforming economy. So already the unemployment rates are very high in low and middle income countries, but we are seeing an increase and will increase, it seems, in the next few years. Currently, about 25% of youth are what we call NEET, so not on employment, education, or training. And so without supporting young people developing the right skills, these NEET rates are likely to increase. So this is where technical and vocational education and training, TVET, can potentially help address unemployment and provide the right skills to individuals. Funding for TVET has been insufficient in these countries, so governments are investing insufficiently, but they don't know precisely where the evidence is, and they don't know, they cannot make decisions based on the evidence. So definitely an understanding of the evidence base is very important to guide programming and research investments. And so this research aims to address this gap. So this is the first systematic mapping of this evidence in these countries. So we took a phased approach, and this is just the second phase. So there'll be a third phase, which I'll touch upon here, but also at the end of the presentation. So we've just finished the second phase, which is this evidence gap map. The first phase, which was in early 2025, where the team established a framework of interventions and outcomes linked to TVET, and this framework guided us in this evidence gap map. So in this phase that we just completed, so March 2026, we are mapping the available evidence, and it will be the focus of this presentation. And in the third phase, we're going to use the evidence that we've mapped in this research to identify, to do a rigorous synthesis, so to identify what works, what costs, and for whom. So just very quickly to give you more information of what we mean by an evidence gap map. So this is a visual and interactive tool to organize the relevant studies into the framework that we established in the first phase, which I'll go into in a bit. In other words, it shows what evidence is available and precisely where. So EGMs can mainly inform programming investments and project design. So it offers a wealth of examples to inform project design. in similar contexts, in different contexts based on that specific intervention and outcomes. And secondly, it can inform research and learning investment. So very effectively, based on this EGM, we can see where we have evidence gaps. And yes, and our EGMs are global public goods and hosted on 3IE's website. And I think the team will share or has shared the link to this work. And so if you click on the link, you'll see something like this. So this is just to very quickly show you what we mean by an evidence gap map. And so it might not be perfectly clear, but just to give you an idea of an evidence gap map. So in the rows, you have the intervention types, and the columns, you have the outcomes, so these interventions and outcomes reflect the framework. And so within each combination, you can see where we have clusters or gaps of evidence. And so in the top, you can use filters to focus on the type of research that you're most interested in, so by region, by country, or also by age targeted in these interventions. So just to say some words about the framework that guided us in this research. So again, this was established in the first phase. So our focus here is on supply side TVET interventions. So these are interventions that aim to provide the right skills to individuals to enter the labor market. We are not focusing here on demand side TVET interventions. So these are interventions aimed to increase the number of job opportunities. And so obviously it is very interesting. We would be very interested to look at demand side TVET interventions, but including it in this research would have meant that our scope would have been unmanageable given the resources and time. So within supply side TVET interventions, we identified 5 intervention groups. So availability, which is focused on creating and increasing number of TVET programs. Then you have access to TVET, which is aiming at overcoming barriers that prevent individuals from pursuing TVET opportunities. Quality of TVET, so that aims to improve the quality, actual delivery of TVET interventions, and supplementary interventions which normally come alongside with TVET interventions. So for example, this is job search interventions, job matching, or signaling, certification of skills interventions. In terms of the outcomes, we have these 6 outcome groups linked to availability of TVET, access, quality of TVET, skills and education, labor market outcomes, and business outcomes. And we'll go into the specifics of individual categories within these intervention and outcome groups. So just to focus very briefly on the methods we use for this evidence gap map. So in order to determine which study should be included or excluded, we had the following inclusion criteria. So it was based on population, interventions, comparison, outcome, study design, language, publication date, and study status. In terms of the population, so we focused on low and middle income countries. We did not focus on high income countries and on large firms or corporations. In terms of interventions, so we focused on supply side interventions. In terms of comparison, the study had to include a comparison group, so either an alternative intervention or NUS or business as usual. In terms of outcomes, so these are the ones I introduced in the framework. So also very importantly, we only included studies that had a experimental or quasi-experimental study design. So these are impact evaluations, and also we included systematic reviews of impact evaluations, or yeah. In terms of language, there's no restriction. The search was from 1st of January 2000 onwards, and we included completed and ongoing studies. So just to give you some information about the search, screening, and data extraction process. So we worked with an information specialist who helped us design a comprehensive search strategy. And so we ran the search in 7 academic databases and 32 grey literature websites. We identified more than 100,000 records after deduplication of records and running the screening based on the inclusion criteria I showed. We identified 680 records. Then we did forward and backward citation tracking. In addition to that, we identified which study was linked to main studies. And so in total, as AR mentioned, we ended up with 510 impact evaluations and 17 systematic reviews. So I'll now pass it on to Dinah, who will go through the results.
Yes, thank you, Pierre. So for the next slide, please. Okay, so in this figure, we show the number of impact evaluations published over time. In the early 2000s, fewer than 20 studies were published each year. From around 2010 onwards, we see a steady increase in the evidence base, and it reflects the growing interest in TVET as a response to unemployment and skills challenges, which aligns with the framework that we use too. For the next slide. So here we see the map that shows how the evidence on TVET is geographically distributed. It is very geographically diverse. We covered 87 countries across all world regions. Most studies were conducted in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. And then this was followed by South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific. However, the evidence, even though it is very diverse, it is still unevenly distributed. Many countries are represented. However, most have only a handful of studies. For instance, we have over 80% of all impact evaluations coming from just 31 countries. This often reflecting large-scale national TVET programs and long-standing investments in research and in evaluation. Next. Now, this figure highlights, slide highlights the importance of evidence gaps across low and middle income countries. So we found that no impact evaluations were present in 54 countries, including 21 small island developing countries. And the evidence was also limited across parts of the Middle East, North Africa, Europe, and Central Asia. When we compare this with recent NEET data from 2023 and 2024, the findings suggest that some of the countries with the highest shares of young people not in education, employment, or training still have very limited evidence on what TVET interventions work. So this can point to key priorities for future research. We have here, for instance, countries with NEET rates higher than 30%, but with serious studies. For instance, Botswana, Eswatini, Honduras, Kiribati, Kosovo, Mali, St. Lucia. And then we have countries with NEET rates higher than 30% with less than 5 studies, which is still very limited: Burkina Faso, Jordan, Lesotho, Gambia, and Zimbabwe. Next, please. Okay, this figure shows how the 510 impact evaluations in the map are distributed across the intervention groups. We have availability of TVET in green, access to TVET in light blue, building quality TVET services in gray, TVET delivery in dark blue, supplementary education and training services in orange, and multi-component interventions across different groups in yellow. The first thing we notice is that the largest cluster of evidence is on TVET delivery interventions, which is shown here in dark blue. These include entrepreneurship training, business training, or on-the-job training. The least evaluated intervention group is availability of TVET. This includes interventions such as formal educational development and private sector development. This is represented here in green. For example, here we found a study that evaluated mandatory apprenticeship hires in Colombia. Now, the second least evaluated group is access to TVET. This covers interventions such as financial and in-kind support and awareness programs. It's represented in the figure in light blue. Now, the bottom part of the figure that shows the multi-component interventions, this refers to programs or activities that used interventions from more than one intervention group and evaluate them as a single package. So we identified some popular combinations here. For instance, where we see delivery plus supplementary, we are referring to the use of an intervention within the TVET delivery group, such as entrepreneurship, and then an intervention within the supplementary education group and training services group, which is, for instance, job matching. So these both were delivered as a package and evaluated as a package. Overall, we see that despite the evidence gaps across categories, an encouraging finding is that we identified no absolute evidence gaps across the framework. Next, please. When this slide shows our evidence regarding outcomes. So the figures again shows the distribution of evaluation across outcome groups. Availability of TVET in green, access to TVET in light blue, quality of TVET services in gray, skills and education outcomes in dark blue, labor market outcomes in orange, and business outcomes in yellow. Here we find that the most evaluated outcomes are those that sit at the end of the causal chain, labor market outcomes. For instance, wage, employment, income, and savings. These are by far the most commonly assessed outcomes. Business outcomes such as business profit and business ownership are also frequently measured. Intermediary outcomes such as program completion, employment transitions, or measures of skill acquisition are less evaluated. Now, the least assessed outcome group is access to TVET, is availability of TVET, and then the second least evaluated access to TVET. The availability of TVET, we just found 7 studies, and this covers interventions such as outcomes such as career aspirations and change in gender norms. Now for the next slide. Okay, so here we see the content of training programs that is reflected by impact evaluations. Most studies evaluated broad or multiple vocational trainings, and many did not distinguish between specific occupations. However, among those studies that reported details, we found that general business training, industry, trade, and services were the most common vocational areas. For core skills, we find that cognitive and metacognitive skills, such as literacy, numeracy, and language skills were the most common, followed by social and emotional skills, like communication or teamwork. What stands out is that the emerging areas are not yet reflected in the evidence base. We found only that one study explicitly mentioned green skills, which is an area of increasing priority to the sector, and also one mentioning artificial intelligence. This was the case of a study that used generative AI to support entrepreneurship training. Next. This slide examines what the evidence says about the delivery approach. Now, despite the world's increasing interest in online methods, face-to-face delivery still dominates the evidence base. We found that 382 studies are using this approach. Online and hybrid models remain relatively uncommon. However, we find that online delivery is growing rapidly, as almost all evaluations of online or hybrid training have been published since 2016, and most since the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, when we look at the intervention length, about half of studies provided information on this, and most evaluated programs lasted less than 6 months, and many were very short. For instance, we found about 23 studies where courses lasted 5 days or less. When it came to longer programs, especially those lasting a year or more, we found that these were typically focused on technical skills training. Next. We also aim to find out which vulnerable populations were being targeted. Fewer than half of evaluations targeted vulnerable populations. In this slide, we see that youth, women, and people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are the most commonly targeted groups. And this is consistent with the fact that these populations often face greater barriers to labor participation. In contrast, relatively few programs are targeting rural populations, persons with disabilities, refugees, conflict-affected populations, or internally displaced people. Now, to the figure on the right shows the participant ages. Only about 30% of studies clearly reported age information, and we found that interventions most commonly targeted individuals aged 18 to 19, whereas those aged 10 to 14 and over 40 were the least represented. Next. We found that the evidence base showed a clear preference for randomized controlled trials as the primary evaluation method. This is the experimental method. Out of the 510 impact evaluations included in the map, 60% used experimental designs, while the remaining 40% relied on quasi-experimental approaches. Next. We also examined whether evaluations included economic analysis and cost analysis, and we found that fewer than 10% of impact evaluations did. Only 29 out of the 510 impact evaluations included a cost-benefit or cost-effectiveness analysis. Well, this is still a very small proportion, 6% to be more precise. It is encouraging because it shows that formal cost analysis, beyond reporting budgets or cost per participant, formal cost analysis is already being integrated into impact evaluations. Next.
Great, thank you.
Back to you, Pierre, for this slide. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. So I'll just finish with the main results to focus on what we found linked to systematic reviews. So that was the second type of study that we included beyond the impact evaluations. And so we found 17 systematic reviews. 3/4 of them were praised as having low confidence, and the only high confidence was published in 2021. So the assessment of the level of confidence of these systematic reviews was based on a critical appraisal that we have included in our report. And so a low confidence systematic review indicates that it did not follow gold standards of evidence synthesis. And so the fact that there's an absence of high confidence systematic reviews in the last few years, and also as we've shown that there's clusters of research on specific combinations of interventions and outcomes, there's definitely a substantial opportunity for new evidence synthesis to support policy and program decision-making in TVET. And so just listed here, 2 potential areas where to do future systematic reviews. So in areas where we do not have high confidence systematic reviews, recent high confidence systematic reviews, and clusters of impact evaluation research. So just to share with you the key takeaways, so just going to go very quickly because we just covered it. So just to tell you about the number of included studies, 510 impact evaluations, 17 systematic reviews. So as we've all said in this at this point, it's a wealth of evidence on multiple TVET topics. There's clusters of evidence in TVET delivery, skills, outcome-linked skills, and labor market outcomes. The evidence base has expanded substantially over the last 1.5 decades. Evidence is mainly concentrated in these 3 regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and East Asia and Pacific, in that order. And yeah, so among the evaluated interventions, where it's reported, short-term face-to-face delivery of TVET dominates, but there is an increase in online learning. And then finally, only half of impact evaluations assessed interventions targeting vulnerable groups. So in terms of implications for policy, so this evidence represents or offers a wealth of evidence that can be used to inform future TVET program design. So it's possible to identify specific relevant studies within the map to guide program design. Secondly, it's very important at this point to support evidence synthesis work to identify what works and for whom, and also at what cost. So rather than investing in research where we already have a cluster of research. And then finally, it's important to expand the scope to support funding for additional impact evaluations on TVET in these 3 areas. So emerging areas of labor market transformation. So this is green energy transition, and of course AI, interventions on access and participation as they were the least evaluated, and then system level reforms in skills development. In terms of implications for researchers, so prioritize research in countries with the highest NEET rates, so where individuals are not employed, not in education and in training, and also within areas that are less researched. So, for example, MENA and small island states. Secondly, similarly for policymakers, it's very important to evaluate impact evaluations on TVET providing skills for AI and green skills, lifelong learning skills. It's important to consider when we're conducting this research to consider the full causal chain of effects, not just the final outcome, although it is important, but it is important to know whether these interventions are increasing skills and increasing knowledge of beneficiaries. Also, it's important to contribute to the standardization of outcome measurement so that these impact evaluations are comparable. And then finally, prioritize systematic views in areas where we have clusters of research. Just to finish very briefly on the 3rd phase of this overall research project. So in the 3rd phase, we will use, as I said earlier, we will use a part of this evidence in the EGM to identify what works, for whom, and at what cost within the supply side TVET interventions. So the scope is obviously currently being discussed, but we will start soon, and most likely there'll be a focus on how the private sector affects the magnitude of the effects, and whether it's targeting specific groups of people, so the heterogeneity of effects. Yeah, so I guess I'll end there. Yeah. Go back to you, Constanza. Stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Pierre and Diana, for that great presentation of the map findings. This is an important body of evidence that provides valuable insights into what can be learned, what has been studied, where the gaps remained, so that future programs and research investments can be better targeted to improve skills development and employment outcomes. So let's now open the floor to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions and not the chat function, so that we can manage better your questions and try to get over as many as possible. Before the first question, I just want to cover a couple of questions that have been already submitted around are there studies available for specific countries? And that's one of the great functions of our evidence gap maps. If our team could share the link to the online map again in the chat, please. You can pick and choose and see the map in many ways as you needed to show the evidence that it's relevant for you. So if you're looking for studies that of interventions that have been implemented in Tanzania, in Ecuador, or whatever country you're interested in, or regions, or any other of the filters that are available in the upper part of the map, you can see those specific studies. And you can also take a look at the whole range of 500 studies. So there is a range and a variety of ways to use the map. So we encourage you to look at the map, interact with it, and there is a multiple of questions that can be answered directly in the map itself. So let's kick off the Q&A with a very interesting question that says, if these results should be interpreted as the status of TVET in this country or across low and middle income countries, or the status of knowledge on TVET from these countries. A status of knowledge on TVET would mean more about the evidence base, but not necessarily the full reality of the TVET space itself. Any volunteers to kick off with that nuance, I think, from an evidence gap map? Abdelrahman, yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Constanza. I really love this question. And probably this question can help us to introduce the why we need evidence gap maps. And honestly, just to tell you a story, like when we started thinking about conducting this entire work, when we started thinking about it, we saw that basically there is not enough evidence that we can find, not enough impact evaluation that focus on learning to earning. And finding that we have 510 impact evaluation itself is extremely important, right? Because this idea at the beginning that basically we just need to generate more evidence without knowing in which area, in which topic, in which regions, what we should do, which areas is basically neglected. There is not enough knowledge about this, right? And what is important here about the evidence gap maps, that's for the first time, we see this framework that allows for including and excluding eligible impact evaluation, and is telling us what is exactly how many studies we have in which areas, and also what is needed, where we should invest more, where we should basically generate more evidence, and where we have enough knowledge, right? This is extremely important because before this, we can make a lot of assumptions, and the risk here is that we might be reinventing the wheels. We're investing in conducting impact evaluation to topics that could basically be tested many times before, with the assumption that they might be novel or not, or there is a need for conducting them. So again, now we can see the amount of evidence and we can see the gaps, and now we can know exactly where we need to invest and where we have enough evidence. We need just to think about using them at scale or informing policymakers based on their results. Thank you.
Callum?
Thank you very much, Constanza. And I think Abdelrahman has covered that vastly better than I would in the detail. But I think the other thing to flag here is that the evidence gap map itself serves a number of functions. One, as has been mentioned, is to identify where there are gaps and where there are areas where we clearly require further monitoring, evaluation, research and learning components built within ongoing projects. The other is, in many ways, from my view, to push back against the claim that we shouldn't be doing TVET because there is no evidence for it. Whilst it's broadly agreed that we don't have an understanding of what that evidence base tells us, I feel confident that now, when somebody turns to me and says, oh, but there's no evidence on TVET, there definitely is that evidence. And frankly, there is more than we expected to find. The next question is to find out what that evidence is really telling us.
Indeed, and I think that that's another nuance between this phase, so we have discussed the three phases between developing a framework that makes sense for the sector, understanding what's the state of the evidence, and then in third phase, understanding what the evidence is and what can we learn from it. And there is a related question about this, related specifically to the cost side or cost effectiveness side of these interventions. So part of the result is that there is a low number of studies containing cost evidence. But there is no mention of the results of those studies. Are those going to be included in the report of the evidence gap map? If we can clarify that.
So I can come in here. So the aim of the evidence gap map is just to identify and categorize the available evidence. So we did not, in this phase, we did not go into detailed cost effectiveness analysis based on the existing cost data that we found. But as I mentioned in the third phase, it would be definitely one of our research questions and a priority of the third phase. Obviously, the scope will be specific to the third phase. So what we identify there will determine how much we can say on the cost effectiveness of these interventions.
Great, thank you. So maybe a little bit more related to the type of interventions that are included. Do we have any insights in terms of how often potential employers participate in these interventions, or learnings on how to incentivize more employers to be more involved in these interventions?
So I can share what we found in the evidence. So in terms of the private sector, so how much the private sector funded these interventions, we did not find much evidence on this. So 5% of studies mentioned or reported that it was funded by the private sector. However, we did find that 25% of studies reported that the private sector was involved in the delivery. So that could have been in different ways with public-private partnerships or simply delivering the interventions. We did, I mean, in addition to this, we also found quite a lot of evidence on the job training. So that was within the delivery intervention group, and yeah, so there is some involvement of employers and the private sector, and I think definitely it would be a focus of the third phase to see how their role influences the results. Yeah.
Great. And then a related topic with a different example. What about interventions that covered the development of the capacity building around language skills? So, for example, English specifically in this question, but the learning of other languages.
Yeah. So that would have fit within the communication skills that were that were put forward in these interventions. So we didn't have a specific in English category for in terms of skill or vocational training. But yeah, so that was definitely a key component of the general core skills. Yeah.
And just to come in on that, I think absolutely right. Yeah, we kind of incorporated that business English and entrepreneurship English into things like communication and those core skills, but also in terms of kind of basic language and basic numeracy skills, we would still view that as part of the foundational learning offer that is broadly agreed to be a necessary underpinning of skills and TVET interventions. So rather than necessarily try and do something that covered the full spectrum of education and relied on everything that might have to come before a TVET and skills group, we decided to just focus on those TVET and skills interventions and acknowledge that basic numeracy, basic literacy comes at a slightly different kind of stage.
Great. So there are a couple of questions around the use of this knowledge in decision making. So these are studies that are evaluating the projects, the interventions themselves. And part of what 3A does is to understand the use. And actually, we are working with FCDO on an evidence-informed decision-making framework to understand the use of evidence in decision-making. But to provide an example, Callum, this is a question for you. How is the map supporting your work at FCDO? And what do you see the next steps at FCDO and more broadly?
I think that's a really great question, and using the FCDO as an example of how this can be used by others and what the next steps might look like for others, it's a great way to do that. From our perspective, we are in a position where there are reductions being made to the UK ODA that is being spent on development. And that does lead to a shift in how we're prioritizing and how we are targeting our work. What that's led to is a position where we need to be really targeted in how we are going to make these interventions. And where we are not in a position to be funding interventions ourselves, we would like to try and make national and international funding and interventions as effective as possible. We're all, I think, aware of the amount of money that is being filtered into skills and TVET interventions, both from national governments and from international donors in that space. I think we are broadly all on the same page that some of that is exceptionally well targeted, some of it might not be. Without clear evidence on what works and what doesn't, we're unable to tell how effective that is. For us in the FCDO, we've decided to put our funding into this area of creating a global public good that is aiming to answer the question of what works and what doesn't work. That will require a number of different steps and will also require a full and wide breadth of education sectors, skill sectors, international governments working together to ensure that whatever products come out of evidence like this are aligned with national needs, are broadly accepted, are agreed upon and utilized. And so I think to answer the question specifically, for us, our intention is to focus our efforts on this evidence generation and make that as impactful as possible in the FCDO. For others, we massively recommend that if there is work going on in skills and TVET, ensure that there is a monitoring, evaluation, research and learning component within that. That will help fill gaps. Make sure that it is as targeted as possible until we have the full outputs of what works and what doesn't work, and get involved in conversations like this, turning up to events like this, being part of advisory groups, working with large donors such as the World Bank to ensure that large funding is being targeted as effectively as possible is one of the best things we can be doing in this space.
Fantastic. Let's do it. Now, a little bit more of a technical question around how we build this map. Given that this is a multidisciplinary review, could you provide a little bit more insights on how what was the selection of the databases that we used, and with two follow-ups. So one is how do we ensure coverage across disciplines that are relevant to TVET and skills, and then how do we ensure coverage in terms of language of studies?
the aim obviously was to have a very comprehensive search result. So we, as I mentioned in the presentation, we worked with information specialists who identified the databases we searched for the data. So in addition to that, the search terms were refined with the advice of the information specialist. And so just to give you so obviously this is in the report, but just to give you an idea of the databases that we included, aiming to cover all disciplines. So we included obviously Ovid, Web of Science, World Bank eLibrary, REPEC, EBSCO Discovery. So that was in terms of the basis, but also we wanted to capture the grey literature, so all the documents that were linked to conferences or working papers, reports, etc. So we also captured that websites, all relevant to obviously TVET. And so yeah, the aim, and I'll stop there, is the aim to be as comprehensive as possible to capture everything linked to TVET in order for us to say that this is a systematic mapping.
Great, thank you. And perhaps let's try to squeeze one more question around how does the map deal or cover or explore gender inclusion and cultural barriers around TVET skills courses and interventions, especially with different contexts across low and middle income countries?
Yeah, so I guess that was a little bit of a surprise as we conducted the research, as we conducted this evidence gap map. We did not find many studies that looked at how the effects varied across gender or disabled groups, other disadvantaged groups. So that was a bit surprising, but obviously there is this information within the EGM to specifically identify the studies that are reporting on these that have a specific focus on these groups.
Yes, and also in that for that question, we did not go deep into the causes that prevent certain groups to participate of TVET programs, but one of the intervention categories was, just like Pierre mentioned, this awareness programs that are targeting particular groups and particular difficulties during TVET education. Just like Pierre mentioned, we didn't find much evidence there, but the fact that it is part of the intervention categories, it's also a sign that it needs more research and a focus for future researchers as well.
Great, thank you. That's a great way to wrap up the Q&A. The links to the report, to the online map are available in the chat. You're going to receive also more information after this session. Do please get in touch with us. We would love to hear how the map is useful for your own work and to connect and to leverage this amazing wealth of information that we have on this topic. So many thanks to our panelists, to our partners at FCDO, and to the entire 3IE team for making today's session possible. And of course, thank you all of you at the audience for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.